Lucy Kane never expected her new home to come with a war. When she first set foot on the property, she had felt nothing but admiration. It was a stunning estate, larger than anything she had ever owned, complete with a pool that gleamed under the afternoon sun like a private oasis. After years of hard work in the corporate world, she had finally saved enough to buy a home that felt like an escape. She was never much for socializing, preferring solitude over neighborhood barbecues, and that was part of the appeal. This house was on the edge of a well-maintained community, close enough to civilization but far enough to remain undisturbed. That sense of control, of peace, was something she valued above all else. She had spent her life making logical decisions, avoiding unnecessary entanglements, and keeping to herself. What she failed to realize was that some places refused to let you stay detached, that some battles found you whether you were willing to fight them or not. The first week after moving in was uneventful, though she had started noticing small things that struck her as odd. The stares from the neighbors as she carried her boxes inside, the way people would pause their conversations when she walked past, the unexpected knocks on her door from complete strangers offering friendly advice about the area. There was something rehearsed about the way they spoke to her, as if they were repeating lines from a script. A woman named Eleanor, who introduced herself as the president of the local neighborhood council, stopped by with a basket of baked goods and an overly bright smile. "We like to make sure new residents feel welcome," she said, her gaze lingering on Lucy's pool just beyond the glass doors. "It's such a lovely property. It must feel like a dream come true." Lucy thanked her, but there was something in the woman's voice, a strange inflection, as if the words held a double meaning. At first, she dismissed the interactions as nothing more than overenthusiastic neighborly curiosity. People in tightly knit communities could be nosy, and she had no reason to assume anything sinister. Still, there was something about the way they lingered just a little too long, how their eyes seemed to flicker between her and her home with something that wasn't quite admiration. A few days later, a man she had never met before casually mentioned how everyone in the neighborhood had always loved that pool while she was at the grocery store. It was a harmless statement on the surface, but it left an unease in her chest that she couldn't quite shake. Then came the first real sign that something was off. One evening, she decided to take a swim. The air was warm, the sky a deep shade of indigo, and she finally felt settled enough to enjoy the space she had worked so hard for. She slipped into the water, letting the coolness wash over her, the hum of the quiet night a comforting presence around her. But as she floated on her back, staring up at the sky, she felt that inexplicable sensation of being watched. Slowly, she turned her head toward the fence line, and there, in the dim glow of her patio lights, stood a figure. A woman, dressed in business casual clothing, her hands folded neatly in front of her, watching in complete silence. Lucy sat up, water dripping from her hair, her heart hammering in her chest. "Can I help you?" she called out, her voice sharper than she intended. The woman tilted her head slightly, the shadow obscuring most of her expression, but Lucy could see just enough to catch the faintest trace of a smile. "Oh, I didn't mean to intrude," the woman said. "I just wanted to see if you were settling in." Lucy narrowed her eyes. "Who are you?" "Eleanor," the woman said, as if Lucy should have already known. "I'm the president of the council." Lucy stood up, gripping the metal railing of the pool's edge. "You already introduced yourself." Eleanor's smile didn't falter. "Yes, but I never got a chance to talk to you about the pool." A sharp chill ran down Lucy's spine. Something about the way she said it made her stomach twist. "What about it?" Eleanor took a step closer, resting her hands on the fence. "The pool has always been a special part of the community," she said. "It was used by the previous owners for neighborhood events, little gatherings. We like to think of it as a shared space." Lucy's fingers tightened around the railing. "It's private property." Eleanor exhaled a soft laugh, shaking her head. Of course. But you see, things like this, spaces like this, sometimes carry a certain expectation. And it's best not to upset the balance." Lucy had spent years in business negotiations. She knew when someone was dancing around a threat, trying to make it sound like a friendly suggestion. Her instinct told her that this was one of those moments. "I'm not interested in neighborhood events," she said flatly. Eleanor's expression didn't change, but the air between them did. The friendliness, the warmth, it was a mask, and Lucy could feel the shift beneath it. "That's disappointing," Eleanor said after a moment. "But I suppose you'll come to understand how things work here soon enough." Lucy watched as the woman turned and walked away, disappearing into the night like she had never been there at all. The next morning she found a note in her mailbox. No envelope, no signature, just a single piece of paper folded in half. "The rules exist for a reason. You should respect them." She stood there, holding the note between her fingers, the paper slightly damp from the morning dew. Her first instinct was to crumple it up and throw it away, to ignore whatever ridiculous game they were trying to play. But something held her back. This wasn't just a nosy neighbor. This was something deeper, something woven into the foundation of this place. For the first time since moving in, she felt the distinct, suffocating sense that she had made a terrible mistake. Lucy had always been a logical person, someone who prided herself on her ability to assess a situation rationally and act accordingly. But standing there on her porch, staring at the cryptic note in her hand, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: unease. The message itself was vague, but it was the implication behind it that unsettled her. It wasn't a simple complaint from a disgruntled neighbor, nor was it an innocent reminder about community guidelines. It was a warning. A statement designed to make her question her own authority over her property, to make her wonder if she had unknowingly stepped into something she wouldn't be able to control. She had dealt with corporate politics before, with men in boardrooms who used veiled threats and passive-aggressive remarks to push their agendas, but this was different. This was personal. This was her home. She turned the note over in her hands, checking for any indication of where it had come from, but there was nothing. No handwriting, no printed signature, just those ominous words in a bold, mechanical font. The paper itself felt slightly damp from the morning air, meaning it had been placed there at some point before sunrise. That thought alone sent a ripple of irritation through her. Someone had come onto her property in the dead of night, close enough to reach her mailbox, close enough to observe her movements. It wasn't just an empty message, it was a demonstration. They wanted her to know she was being watched. For a moment, she considered marching straight to Eleanor's house and demanding an explanation. But she stopped herself. If this was indeed her doing, confronting her head-on wouldn't get Lucy anywhere. People like Eleanor didn't respond to aggression, they thrived on control. The way she had spoken to Lucy the night before, with that calm, unshakable certainty, made it clear she wasn't someone who played fair. If Lucy went after her without proof, it would only solidify the narrative that she was an outsider who didn't respect the traditions of the neighborhood. No, if Eleanor was going to play a long game, then Lucy needed to be 2 steps ahead. She folded the note and set it aside, deciding to go about her morning as if nothing had happened. She wouldn't let them see that they had rattled her. That was how people like this operated, testing the waters, pushing boundaries, waiting to see how much someone would tolerate before they broke. She refused to be their next easy target. But as the days passed, the pressure mounted in ways she hadn't anticipated. It started small. The garbage collectors suddenly forgot to pick up her trash, leaving her bins overflowing at the end of her driveway, while every other house on the block remained pristine. Her mail delivery became sporadic, with important bills and documents arriving late or not at all. When she called the utility company to report an unexpected water shutoff, the representative informed her that her service had been mistakenly marked as inactive due to an ownership dispute. That one stopped her cold. "An ownership dispute," she repeated, gripping the phone tighter. "Yes, Mom," the woman on the other end said, her voice polite but indifferent. "It looks like we received a request from the neighborhood association stating that the property's status was under review. We usually verify these things before making changes, but somehow this one slipped through the cracks." Lucy took a slow breath, trying to keep her frustration in check. "And who exactly submitted this request?" "I'm afraid I can't disclose that information," the woman said, "but if it was an error, we can get it resolved. It'll take a few business days." A few business days. They wanted to make her life difficult. They wanted to show her that no matter how much she thought she owned this house, she was still at their mercy. After hanging up, she sat at her kitchen table, staring at the sleek modern appliances she had so carefully chosen, the open floor plan she had envisioned for years before finally making it a reality. She had worked for this. She had earned this. And yet, it was becoming increasingly clear that in the eyes of these people, it didn't matter. They saw her as an intruder, a mistake that needed correcting. The final straw came one evening when she returned from a late meeting and pulled into her driveway, only to find a group of strangers standing near her pool. She slammed the car door shut, her pulse spiking as she strode toward them. There were 4 of them, 3 adults and 1 teenager dressed casually, their demeanor completely at ease, as if they belonged there. One of the men, a tall, broad-shouldered guy in his 40s, turned to look at her as she approached. He didn't look surprised to see her. "Can I help you?" she demanded, her voice sharp. The man smiled, not moving from where he stood. "Just enjoying the view," he said, gesturing toward the pool. "It's a nice setup you've got here." Lucy glanced around, searching for any sign that they had broken in, but the gate was ajar. Not forced open, not damaged. Just open, as if someone had left it that way on purpose. "You're trespassing," she said evenly. "I need you to leave." The teenager, a boy no older than 16, scoffed. "Chill, lady. We're not hurting anything." Lucy clenched her jaw, resisting the urge to escalate the situation. "I'm not asking. Get out." The older man exhaled through his nose, clearly unimpressed by her show of authority, but he nodded once and motioned for the others to follow. As they filed out through the gate, he turned back to her. "You should relax," he said. "It's just water." Then they were gone. She locked the gate behind them, her hands trembling slightly as she slid the bolt into place. Just water. The words lingered, an echo of something unspoken. It wasn't just about the pool. It was about control. About reminding her that she was standing on ground that had once belonged to someone else, that in their minds it still did. That night, she made a decision. She was done reacting. It was time to start fighting back. Lucy didn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts racing through every unsettling event of the past few weeks. The note. The water shut off. The strangers in her backyard. It was clear to her now this wasn't just petty neighborhood politics. This was calculated. This was designed to make her feel unwelcome, to wear her down, to make her question whether staying here was worth the effort. But she wasn't the type to back down. If they wanted to play games, she would make sure they knew she was playing too. The next morning she did what she should have done earlier. She called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but one specializing in property disputes and community governance. When she explained her situation, detailing every strange occurrence, the woman on the other end of the line listened carefully before responding in a measured tone. "They're testing you," she said, "pushing boundaries, seeing how much you'll tolerate before you either submit or leave. This isn't uncommon in neighborhoods like yours, where long-standing residents feel entitled to dictate how things work. The good news is that legally they have no standing. The bad news is that doesn't mean they'll stop." Lucy exhaled slowly, gripping her coffee mug as she stared out at her backyard, at the crystal-clear pool that had somehow become the center of this entire ordeal. "So what do I do?" "You document everything," the lawyer said. "Every interaction, every incident, no matter how small. You request copies of any records they claim give them authority over your property. You make it clear that you're not intimidated. The moment they realize you won't roll over, they'll either escalate or back off." Lucy didn't like the sound of escalation, but she liked the idea of being bullied even less. She spent the next few hours making calls, gathering paperwork, and filing formal complaints where necessary. She contacted the water company to ensure no further accidental service disruptions, spoke with the postal service about her missing mail, and even installed a second set of locks on her gates. If they wanted to make her uncomfortable, she would make their interference as difficult as possible. But it didn't take long for them to push back. That evening, as she stepped outside with a glass of wine, hoping to unwind after a stressful day, she noticed something off. The gate to the pool, her locked gate, was slightly ajar again. A chill ran down her spine as she approached, heart pounding. Had she forgotten to latch it properly? No, she had checked it twice before heading inside. She was sure of it. She pushed it open, stepping cautiously onto the patio, her eyes scanning the area. And then she saw it. Floating in the center of the pool was a single lawn chair, one she recognized as belonging to the community clubhouse down the road. It bobbed lazily in the water, its white plastic frame eerily out of place. Lucy's stomach clenched. This wasn't random. Someone had put it there, not just to trespass but to send a message. She took a slow breath, trying to steady herself, before pulling out her phone and calling the non-emergency police line. When the officer arrived, he listened patiently as she explained what had been happening, nodding in all the right places. But when she got to the part about the chair, he hesitated. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I understand why this is unsettling, but there's no actual crime here. There's no forced entry, no property damage. I can file a report, but unless you have footage or a witness, there's not much we can do." Lucy clenched her jaw. Of course, that was the point, wasn't it? Whoever was doing this knew exactly where the line was. They weren't just harassing her, they were doing it in a way that left her with no real recourse. After the officer left, she fished the chair out of the pool, tossed it onto the grass, and stood there for a long time, staring at the water. The rage bubbling in her chest was almost enough to make her scream, but she swallowed it down. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The next morning, she took things a step further. She went to the community clubhouse, the very place that chair had come from. It was a modest building, nothing particularly grand, but it was well kept, clearly a hub for local gatherings. She pushed open the doors and stepped inside, her presence immediately drawing attention. Conversations quieted, eyes turned toward her, some curious, some wary. She spotted Eleanor almost instantly, standing near a window, a cup of tea in hand. The older woman smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Lucy," she said smoothly, setting her cup down. "What a surprise. How are you settling in?" Lucy didn't bother with pleasantries. "Someone left a chair from this clubhouse in my pool last night." Eleanor's smile didn't falter. If anything, she looked amused. "That sounds frustrating. I do hope it was just a prank." Lucy took a step closer, keeping her voice even. "I want to be very clear. I don't want any part of whatever traditions this neighborhood has regarding my property. My pool is mine. My home is mine. I don't care what happened before I got here. It ends now." Eleanor tilted her head slightly, as if considering her words. Then, she exhaled a soft chuckle. "Oh, Lucy, you misunderstand. No one is trying to take anything from you." She picked up her tea again, taking a slow sip before adding, "We're simply reminding you that this place existed long before you did, and it will exist long after." Lucy's fists tightened at her sides. She wanted to argue, to demand answers, but she knew better than to let Eleanor dictate the conversation. She turned on her heel and walked out, ignoring the weight of their stares as she pushed through the doors. That night, she barely slept. Every noise outside sent her pulse racing, every shadow seemed to stretch too long. She checked the locks twice, then 3 times. She told herself she was being paranoid, that no one would be foolish enough to push things further. She was wrong. The next morning, she stepped outside and stopped cold. Her pool, her pristine, carefully maintained pool, was filled with dead leaves and debris, floating in murky, almost black water. It had been perfectly clean the night before. There hadn't been any wind, no storms. This wasn't natural. She took a shaky step forward, staring into the water. Something about it felt wrong, too dark, too still, and then she saw it. Near the bottom, barely visible beneath the surface, was something that didn't belong. A shape. A figure. Her stomach lurched, and for one horrible second, she thought it was a body. She nearly staggered back, bile rising in her throat, before forcing herself to focus. It wasn't a body. It was a mannequin. A life-sized, human-shaped mannequin, fully dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned swimsuit, its plastic limbs distorted by the water. Her breath came in short gasps as she scrambled for her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed. The police arrived quickly this time, 2 officers stepping onto her patio, their expressions unreadable as they took in the scene. One of them let out a low whistle. "Jesus," he muttered. "This is something." Lucy hugged her arms around herself, struggling to maintain composure. "I want to know who did this. I want cameras checked. I want someone questioned." The older officer sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "We'll file a report." "But ma'am, whoever's doing this, they're careful. No broken locks, no signs of forced entry. If it's a prank, it's a damn elaborate one." A prank. That's what they would call it. That's what they wanted her to believe. But Lucy knew better. This wasn't a joke. This was a warning. Lucy had never felt fear like this before, not the kind that came from physical danger, but the kind that crept under her skin, slow and suffocating, making every moment feel like she was teetering on the edge of something inevitable. The image of the mannequin floating in her pool was burned into her mind, its distorted limbs swaying in the dark water like a silent, twisted warning. The police had treated it as nothing more than a prank, taking a few notes, offering a vague promise to keep an eye out, but Lucy knew better. This wasn't random. This wasn't some bored teenager playing games. This was deliberate, calculated, designed to make her feel powerless. But fear and anger often came hand in hand, and as she drained the pool, watching the last of the filthy water swirl away, she felt her resolve harden. She had followed the rules, done everything the right way. She had contacted the authorities, documented every incident, sought legal counsel, but none of it mattered. The people behind this weren't afraid of the law because they didn't need to be. They operated in the spaces between regulations, in the gaps where accountability dissolved. They knew how to press just enough to make life unbearable without crossing the line into something truly criminal. They were masters of manipulation, and she had walked straight into their game. But she had no intention of playing by their rules anymore. The next morning, she took a different approach. If they wanted to act like she was the intruder in their world, then she would become one. She spent hours researching the history of the neighborhood, scouring public records, real estate transactions, even old newspaper articles. She wanted to know exactly what she was up against, who had lived in this house before her, and why the pool seemed to be the unspoken center of it all. What she found didn't surprise her, but it sent a chill down her spine nonetheless. The previous owner, an elderly man named Howard Grayson, had lived in the house for nearly 40 years before suddenly selling it at a loss and leaving town. There was no record of where he went, no forwarding address, nothing. Before him, the house had changed hands more times than any other property in the neighborhood, with each owner staying only a few years before selling abruptly. Some sales were accompanied by legal disputes, some by unexplained liens, but all of them pointed to the same conclusion: this house had never truly belonged to the people who bought it. It had always been under someone else's control. She dug deeper, finding old forum posts from people who had once lived in the area, vague mentions of a community tradition involving the pool, whispers about how it had been shared space long before official property lines had been drawn. But none of it was concrete. Just fragmented pieces of a puzzle she couldn't yet put together. She needed to speak to someone who had lived through it. Tracking down Howard Grayson was nearly impossible. His name led nowhere, his old phone number was disconnected, and even his financial records seemed to vanish after the sale of the house. But persistence was a skill Lucy had perfected over years of navigating high-stakes negotiations, and after hours of searching, she finally found a single, obscure reference to a property he had purchased under a different name, a small, remote home a few towns over. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead she had. The drive was 2 hours, cutting through quiet roads lined with trees that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. When she finally reached the address, the house was exactly what she had expected: modest, isolated, the kind of place someone chose when they wanted to disappear. She hesitated only briefly before stepping up to the door and knocking. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slow, deliberate footsteps approached from the other side. The door creaked open just enough to reveal an older man, his sharp eyes narrowing as he took her in. "You're not supposed to be here," he said, his voice rough, edged with something that wasn't quite fear but close. Lucy didn't waste time. "You used to own my house," she said. "I need to know why you left." Howard stared at her for a moment, then exhaled a tired laugh. "You bought it." It wasn't a question. It was a statement tinged with something that made her stomach twist. She nodded. "And ever since I moved in, strange things have been happening. I think you know why." He didn't respond right away, just studied her as if weighing whether or not she could handle whatever truth he had locked away. Then, with a sigh, he stepped back and motioned for her to come in. The inside of the house was sparse, lived in but lacking any real sense of permanence. Howard sat heavily in an old chair, rubbing a hand over his face. "I should have burned the damn place down before I left," he muttered. Lucy didn't react. She just waited. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "That pool doesn't belong to you. It never did. And it sure as hell didn't belong to me." She frowned. "What do you mean?" Howard let out another humorless laugh. "You ever wonder why the neighborhood is so invested in what happens on your property? Why they care so damn much about that pool?" She didn't answer, but he took her silence as confirmation. "It goes back decades," he said. "Maybe longer. Before the houses, before the roads. That land, it was always a gathering place. A place where decisions were made, where people came together. And that pool, it was the center of it all. Doesn't matter who owns the house on paper. That space was never meant to belong to just one person." Lucy felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. "So what? They just expect me to hand it over." "They expect you to fall in line," he said. "Just like the rest of us did. Some people go along with it. Some people fight. And the ones who fight, well," he gestured vaguely around the house, "they don't last long." Lucy shook her head, unwilling to accept the inevitability in his tone. "That's insane. It's just a pool. It's my property." Howard met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "That's what I thought too." She wanted to press him for more, to ask what exactly had happened that made him leave, but she could see it in his face. Whatever he had endured, he wasn't willing to relive it. She left soon after, her mind spinning, trying to make sense of what she had learned. On the drive back, her phone buzzed with a notification, an email from an unknown sender. "You shouldn't have gone looking. Some things are better left alone." Her grip tightened on the steering wheel. She was done being afraid. If they wanted her out, they would have to do a hell of a lot more than send warnings. Lucy had never been the kind of person to believe in fate, but as she stared at the email glowing on her phone screen, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that she had crossed a line she wasn't meant to. She read the message again, half expecting the words to shift, to change into something less ominous, but they remained the same. "You shouldn't have gone looking. Some things are better left alone." There was no sender information, no name, just a cold, detached warning delivered with surgical precision. Whoever had sent it wasn't trying to intimidate her with dramatics, they were simply stating a fact. A fact that she had no intention of accepting. She spent the rest of the drive back from Howard Grayson's house running through everything he had told her. The pool, the land, the way the neighborhood viewed it as something that existed beyond legal ownership. It was absurd, archaic, but at the same time it explained so much. This wasn't just about a group of overbearing homeowners trying to impose their will. This was something deeper, something ingrained in the foundation of the community itself. And that made it even more dangerous. By the time she pulled into her driveway, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across her yard. The house looked the same as it always did, silent, waiting, but Lucy had the unsettling sensation that she was being watched. She turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, forcing herself to breathe. She had never been paranoid before, had never been the type to imagine threats where there were none. But this wasn't imagination. This was real. She stepped out of the car, scanning the street. A few houses down, a curtain shifted, but when she looked directly at the window, it was still. Nothing but the faint glow of a lamp inside. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe it was another reminder that she was never truly alone here. She had barely made it to her front door when she noticed the envelope. It was propped neatly against the frame, as if someone had placed it there just moments before she arrived. She bent down, hesitated, then picked it up. No return address. Just her name, written in precise, almost mechanical handwriting. She took it inside, locking the door behind her before carefully tearing it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the message typed in the same impersonal font as the email. This is your final opportunity to do the right thing. The pool belongs to the neighborhood. The history of this place is not yours to rewrite. Remove the fence, restore access, and let things return to the way they were. There will be no further warnings. Lucy exhaled sharply, pressing the paper flat against the counter as if doing so would somehow make the words less ridiculous. They were actually demanding that she give up her own property. Not sell it, not negotiate, just surrender. As if she were a placeholder, a temporary occupant with no real claim to what was hers. She should have been scared. A week ago she might have been. But now she was furious. They had pushed her at every turn, worn her down piece by piece, expecting her to break. But she wasn't going to break. She was going to push back. She grabbed her phone and dialed her lawyer's number. The call went straight to voicemail. "Ms. Kane, I was actually about to call you," the voicemail began, the woman's voice carefully neutral. "I've reviewed your case, and while I understand your concerns, I don't believe I can be of further assistance. It seems like this is more of a community dispute than a legal matter. And I wouldn't want to waste your time pursuing something that may not hold up in court. I'm refunding your retainer. Best of luck." Lucy listened to the message twice, her mind racing. She had spoken to this woman less than 48 hours ago. She had been confident, ready to fight. What had changed? She didn't need to ask. She already knew. The neighborhood had gotten to her. The realization settled in her stomach like lead. She had known they were powerful, that they operated in ways that made traditional avenues of defense useless. But she hadn't expected them to act this quickly, this decisively. They wanted her isolated. They wanted her to feel like she had no options left. And for the first time, she wondered if maybe they were right. That night, she barely slept. She kept the lights on, every noise outside making her pulse spike, every shadow stretching too far across her bedroom walls. She considered calling the police again, but she already knew how that would go. They would show up, take a report, maybe do a cursory drive through the neighborhood, and then they would leave. Because nothing illegal had happened. Because she couldn't prove who was behind any of this. And that was the brilliance of it. They weren't trying to scare her in the traditional sense. They weren't threatening her with violence or destruction. They were making her doubt herself. Making her feel like no matter what she did, no matter how hard she fought, they would always be one step ahead. But Lucy had spent her entire career navigating impossible situations, outmaneuvering people who thought they had already won. If they wanted to play dirty, then so would she. The next morning she started making calls. Not to lawyers, not to the police, but to people who understood how to fight battles that didn't happen in courtrooms. People who knew how to dig into the things that weren't meant to be found. She contacted an investigator, someone who specialized in uncovering backroom deals and hidden connections. She didn't tell them everything, just enough to make it clear that she needed information. And then she waited. For the next few days, things were quiet. Too quiet. It was the kind of silence that felt intentional, like they were waiting for her to make the next move. She kept up her usual routine, going to work, coming home, acting as if nothing had changed. But every time she stepped outside, she felt the weight of unseen eyes, the lingering presence of something just beyond her line of sight. Then, late one evening, her phone rang. "I found something," the investigator said, his voice low, "and you're not going to like it." Lucy tightened her grip on the phone. "Tell me." There was a pause. The neighborhood association isn't just some overzealous group of retirees trying to maintain property values. They're involved in something a hell of a lot bigger. I traced some financial records, donations, shell companies, off-the-books transactions. Money is moving through this place in ways that don't make sense. And it all leads back to the same people. Lucy's blood ran cold. Eleanor, bingo. She pressed a hand against the counter, trying to steady herself. What are they doing? That's the part one haven't figured out yet, he admitted. But whatever it is, they don't want you digging into it. And if I were you, I'd be very careful about what you do next. Lucy exhaled slowly. Careful. She was done being careful. She had tried to play by the rules. She had tried to fight this the right way. But if they wanted her gone so badly, if they were willing to go to these lengths to force her out, then she needed to find out why. And she needed to do it before it was too late. Lucy had never been the kind of person to act impulsively. Every major decision in her life had been weighed, analyzed, broken down into logical components before she committed to it. But as she stood in her kitchen, gripping her phone, listening to the investigator's voice echo in her ears, she felt something shift inside her. She had spent weeks being careful, trying to approach this like a legal battle, like something that could be solved through the proper channels. But this wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't even a dispute. It was a siege, and she was the one trapped inside the fortress, waiting for the inevitable breach. That had to change. She forced herself to think, to take the emotion out of it. If Eleanor and her people had influence over the authorities, if they had buried financial transactions leading back to them, then whatever they were protecting wasn't just about control over her pool. That had been obvious from the beginning. No one put this much effort into harassment for the sake of a community tradition. There was something else at play here, something hidden just beneath the surface, and she needed to expose it before they decided to make her disappear the way they had with Howard Grayson and the others who had come before her. That night she made a plan. The investigator had uncovered financial movements, but it wasn't enough to prove anything. She needed more, something undeniable, and if this community had spent decades protecting whatever secret lay at the heart of it, then the evidence had to be close. They wouldn't keep something this sensitive in plain sight, but they also wouldn't risk it being stored somewhere outside their control. That left one possibility: the clubhouse. It made perfect sense. It was the one place in the neighborhood that had remained constant through every change in ownership, the one place she had seen Eleanor and her followers gather like clockwork. It was where they had met to discuss her fate, where they had decided how to deal with her presence, and if she was right, it was where they kept the proof she needed. She waited until midnight. The streets were silent, the houses dark, but Lucy knew better than to assume she wasn't being watched. She dressed in black, moving with careful precision as she slipped out the back door and cut through the side of her property, keeping to the shadows. The clubhouse was only a few blocks away, nestled at the end of a cul-de-sac, its lights extinguished, its doors locked. But Lucy had expected that. She had spent the afternoon studying its layout, noting the windows, the security system, the points of entry. The locks were standard, nothing she couldn't bypass. It took her less than 2 minutes to force the back door open without setting off any alarms. Either they were too confident to think someone would ever try breaking in, or they had no reason to believe they needed high-end security. The inside of the clubhouse was pristine, eerily maintained, like a place frozen in time. The furniture was arranged in neat, precise rows, the bookshelves lined with old ledgers and binders filled with meeting minutes. Lucy moved quickly, searching through cabinets, drawers, anything that might hold what she was looking for. At first it was nothing but mundane documents, budget reports, event planning schedules, standard legal agreements. But then, in the bottom drawer of a locked filing cabinet, she found something different. A ledger. Thick, worn at the edges, its pages filled with handwritten notes. She flipped through it, her breath catching as she scanned the entries. Names, dates, amounts of money listed in neat columns. Some of the names she recognized: former property owners, people who had lived in the neighborhood before mysteriously moving away. Next to each name was a notation: reclaimed. She turned another page. More names, more money, and then, at the very bottom, something that made her blood run cold: her own name. Next to it, a date, 3 days from now, and beside that, the same notation: reclaimed. She didn't have time to process the full weight of what she was seeing before she heard the soft creak of a door opening somewhere in the building. Lucy froze, her heart slamming against her ribs as she listened. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Someone else was here. She shut the ledger, shoving it under her jacket as she backed away from the desk, her mind racing. There was only one exit the way she had come in. If they had locked it behind her, she was trapped. The footsteps grew closer, and then a voice echoed through the darkness. "I was wondering how long it would take you to figure it out. Eleanor." Lucy turned slowly, gripping the edge of the desk. The older woman stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable, her posture calm, as if she had expected this all along. "You just couldn't leave it alone, could you?" Eleanor sighed, stepping further into the room. "I tried to be reasonable. I gave you opportunities to do the right thing." Lucy swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay composed. "The right thing? You mean handing over my home because you think you own it?" Eleanor tilted her head slightly, as if amused by the accusation. Ownership is such a fickle concept. Legally, sure, you signed some papers, but this place has never truly belonged to any one person. It's bigger than you, bigger than any of us, and those who refuse to understand that. She gestured toward the ledger under Lucy's jacket. "Well, I'm sure you can see the pattern." Lucy's hands clenched, reclaimed. Eleanor smiled. "You're smart. You should consider that a compliment." Lucy's mind raced. She needed to get out. She needed to get this ledger somewhere safe before Eleanor had a chance to stop her. But she could already hear movement outside, more footsteps approaching. She had walked into a trap, and they had been waiting for her to spring it. She took a slow step back. What happens now? Eleanor exhaled, almost disappointed. "You pack your things, you leave quietly, and you forget everything you think you know." Lucy's pulse pounded in her ears. "And if I don't?" Eleanor studied her for a long moment before shaking her head. "Then you'll end up like the others." Lucy didn't wait for clarification. She moved fast, lunging for the nearest exit, shoving past Eleanor before she could react. The older woman stumbled, cursing under her breath, but Lucy didn't stop. She sprinted down the hallway, out the back door, her only thought to get home, to get somewhere safe. But as she reached her property, breathless and shaking, she stopped cold. Her front door was open. The lights inside were on. And waiting for her, standing in the doorway as if he had been invited, was one of the men from the pool. The broad-shouldered one. The one who had told her to relax. He smiled at her like they were old friends. "Welcome home, Lucy." Lucy didn't move. Her pulse pounded so hard in her ears that for a moment she could hear nothing else. The man in the doorway stood there like he had all the time in the world, shoulders relaxed, hands in his pockets, as if he had simply wandered in by mistake. But his eyes told a different story. There was no casual curiosity in them, no awkward apology for trespassing. There was only patience, the kind of patience that came from knowing he had already won. She forced herself to breathe, to think. The ledger was still tucked under her jacket, pressing against her ribs. If he saw it, if he realized she had proof of what they were doing, she wouldn't get another chance. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she knew that was exactly what they wanted. Running would confirm to them that she was afraid, that she had already accepted her place in whatever twisted game they were playing. She couldn't give them that. So she took a step forward, deliberate, measured. She kept her expression carefully neutral as she walked up the driveway, closing the distance between them. The man didn't move, didn't react, just kept watching her with that unreadable gaze. "I don't remember inviting you in," she said, her voice calm despite the fire in her chest. The man smiled slightly. "We wanted to make sure you got home safely." Lucy stopped a few feet away from him, angling herself slightly so that her right hand was free. If she had to use the pepper spray in her pocket, she needed to be fast. "Who's we?" He gestured lazily behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know Eleanor was there. She could feel it, the weight of her presence pressing against the night air. "You should come inside," Eleanor said smoothly, stepping forward just enough for Lucy to see her out of the corner of her eye. "No need to make this more difficult than it has to be." Lucy almost laughed. Difficult? They had been making her life hell for weeks, pushing her from every angle, waiting for her to cave. And now they were pretending this was some polite negotiation? She turned her attention back to the man blocking her door. Move. He didn't. But he also didn't stop her when she brushed past him, stepping over the threshold. The house was exactly as she had left it, save for one thing: the envelope sitting neatly on her kitchen counter, her name written in the same precise handwriting as the last one. She didn't open it. She didn't have to. Instead, she turned to face Eleanor, who had followed her inside with all the ease of someone who had done this before. "You think I'm going to just walk away?" Lucy said. Eleanor sighed, like a teacher dealing with a particularly stubborn student. "I think you're intelligent enough to recognize when you're outmatched." Lucy tilted her head slightly. "What happens if I don't leave?" Eleanor's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Then things get complicated." Lucy let the silence stretch between them, forcing Eleanor to fill it. People like her hated silence. They thrived on control, on dictating the course of a conversation, of a situation. And sure enough, after a few seconds, Eleanor continued. "There are ways to make life unpleasant, Lucy. You've already had a taste of that. But there are other ways, too, more permanent ones." Lucy's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. She wasn't sure if that was a direct threat or just another calculated push to make her crack. But it didn't matter. She had already made her decision. She reached into her jacket, pulling out the ledger, and dropped it onto the counter between them. Eleanor's expression flickered just for a second, but it was enough. "You don't control me," Lucy said quietly. "And now you don't control this either." Eleanor's jaw tightened, but she didn't lunge for the book. She wasn't stupid. She knew Lucy wouldn't have revealed it unless she had a plan. The man by the door shifted slightly, the first sign of tension he had shown all night. "What do you think you're going to do with that?" Lucy exhaled slowly. "I don't have to do anything with it. I just have to make sure other people see it." Eleanor stared at her, calculating. "You're bluffing." Lucy met her gaze evenly. "Try me." For the first time, Eleanor hesitated. It was slight, barely there, but Lucy caught it. She had spent her entire life learning how to read people, and right now she could see the gears turning in Eleanor's head. There were too many variables now, too many risks. They had controlled the narrative for so long, operating in shadows, keeping everything just vague enough that no one could ever pin them down. But this was tangible, real. If Lucy had been willing to go this far, there was no telling how far she was prepared to take it. Eleanor inhaled deeply, smoothing down the front of her blazer. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost regretful. "I was hoping you'd understand." Lucy didn't answer. Eleanor studied her for a moment longer, then turned to the man at the door. "We're done here," he frowned. Just like that, Eleanor gave him a look, one that said more than words ever could. And just like that, the tension in the room shifted. The fight drained out of it, not in defeat, but in recognition of a battle that wasn't worth escalating for now. The man exhaled sharply, clearly unhappy with the decision, but he didn't argue. He stepped outside first, and Eleanor lingered for only a moment before following him. She paused in the doorway, glancing back at Lucy. "This isn't over." Lucy met her gaze, unblinking. "I know," and then she was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. Lucy didn't move, didn't breathe, until she heard the sound of car doors closing, of engines starting. Even then, she waited, staring at the front door, as if expecting them to change their minds and come back. But they didn't. They had lost. Not entirely, not forever, but tonight they had lost. Lucy let out a slow breath and turned back to the counter, her eyes falling on the ledger. It was only a matter of time before they found another way to try again, before they regrouped and figured out their next move. But that was fine, because now she was ready. She had spent her entire life believing that control was something you built, something you protected. But she had learned something else in the past few weeks. Control wasn't just about ownership. It wasn't about property lines or legal documents. It was about perception. And for the first time since moving into this house, she had taken control of the way they saw her. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't an outsider. She was a threat. And as long as she remained one, they would never be able to take what was hers.